Welcome to the Covert Access Team podcast. This episode explores the world of black teaming in the public versus private sectors, breaking down how the work, culture, and risks differ across environments like corporations, government agencies, and critical infrastructure. Today we're talking with CAT Chief Instructor Brian Harris. Brian, I know you work in both sectors, so you know quite a bit about both sides of this coin. I'd like to start at the beginning. What does it take to get into physical pen testing in the public sector versus the private sector?
Okay, so the public sector is easier because the public sector is what the vast majority of people are going to be aware of. This is your experience, interest, certifications, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of roads to go down. For me, for instance, I got into the private sector by first starting off in, oddly, applied mathematics, where I was working for various groups, private and public, doing applied math kind of things. Some really fun projects at the time, but the applied math stuff got me into the cybersecurity thing, which then got me into the physical security thing. And then I've been doing kind of both for around 20 years, give or take. So first off, there is no right or wrong way to go about it, right? We've had a lot of people who do career changes, everything from, CEOs and CISOs to journalists to soldiers there's no right or wrong way to go about it. It's the first thing you have to have, though, is a good hardcore interest in the subject, just like anything else. But when it comes to certifications, there's a few organizations out there that will offer you certifications in covert entry. Most of them that listeners will be aware of are reputable, and they teach a good class. So you could go that route. But at the same time, you can do other things. You can get into you can get into locksmithing, and you can get into social engineering, and you can do all these types of things. Because one of the things you have to understand is when you get into cyber pen testing, well, what exactly does that mean? If you're a cyber pen tester, does that mean you definitely know how to do Wi-Fi pen testing, or mobile pen testing, or API pen testing, or network pen testing? Like, just because you say I'm a cyber pen tester, that doesn't necessarily mean that you know all of these fields. And at the same time, you don't have to know all of these fields, right? So similarly, with a black team or a physical pen test, if you are a master social engineer, you can talk your way out of any problem, and you can talk your way into any place. Okay, well, it doesn't really matter much if you can pick a lock. But at the same time, if you are a master lock picker, and there isn't a lock that exists that can keep you out for more than 5 minutes, then it doesn't matter if you're a social engineer or not. So when it comes to the certifications are great. They're a really good foundation. But what really matters is your interest, and you need to have some kind of a niche that really appeals to you, whether that's lockpicking, building scaling, social engineering, team planning, whatever it is, right? Now, the fundamental difference with the public sector is the public sector usually approaches this in one of two directions. If you are coming to the public sector from the private sector, then that means you have to already know what you're doing. You have to already be vetted. You have to already know what you're doing. And usually the public sector kind of cherry picks you into a role, right? I've had that happen to me many times. On the other hand, if you're in the public sector, oftentimes people in the public sector kind of just waft between different roles. So maybe you're in the public sector and you do information security, and you get bored of that. And so you put in a transfer for physical pen testing or some derivative thereof. And then you go and do that for a few years. And then you go do something else for a few years. In the public sector, people just tend to bounce around various roles in whatever interests them and whatever their capabilities are and other things. And they'll usually stay for a few years, and then they kind of waft into something else. So as far as how you get into it, it is as varied as anything else. The majority of listeners are probably going to be from the private sector. So from the private sector, watch YouTube videos, practice lockpicking, practice social engineering, get a certification or two if you can, and also realize that if you are already working as a consultant or as a cyber pen tester or other things, and you want to branch out into this, it's going to be your job to convince your management why is this important, why can it be sold, and how to go about that. And then work with your sales team. Because if you can work with your sales team and your management to help them understand how to sell black team engagements, physical pen testing, physical auditing, all that kind of stuff, then you get the experience, right? So it's a win-win, right? If you help your company to understand why this is important and how to sell it, then they make more money and you get the experience. So it's a win-win. So these are all kind of how you could go about it. But again, there is no right or wrong way to do it. I've known people who are I've met and talked to people who were hotel concierge who got into social engineering, and now they work as a professional social engineer for physical penetration testing, right? So there is no right or wrong way to go about this. It's just you have to have an interest in it. You have to have what are you good at and what are you interested in, right? If you are terrified of heights, you're not going to be building scaling, but you might be able to talk your way into a building or pick a lock or something like that.
Sure. So I'm glad that we discussed certifications and hiring paths, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about clearances and what clearances might be required, particularly for the public sector.
Right. Okay. So fundamentally, this goes for public and private. The more sensitive locations that you are going to be penetration or you're going to be testing, you need a better security clearance. So for example, if you are going to be running a pen test on the local IT repair shop, no security clearance is likely needed. But if you're going to go do a physical pen test on FBI headquarters or the Pentagon or some secret site or a nuclear reactor or something, then yes, you are going to need very high security clearances. So, and unfortunately, so here's the trade-off, right? In the public sector, let's start with the private sector. In the private sector, oftentimes you need zero security clearance to get in, and then they will encourage you to get security clearances as you kind of progress. So let's suppose for a minute that you are a cyber pen tester working as a consultant in the private sector. Man, it's hard to say. So you don't need anything to get that job. To do cyber pen testing, you don't need anything typically to have that job. But your company comes back and says, hey, we want you to run cyber pen testing on this government entity, on this critical infrastructure, on this energy firm, etc. At that point, you might need a regional security clearance. You might need a standard security clearance. You might need a NATO security clearance. And it would just depend on what are you pen testing. So, but by contrast, in the public sector, oftentimes to even get into the public sector, you have to have security clearances. Like they're going to vet you, right? They don't want to go through the problem of running, if you need visas or if you want to get into the job or anything else. They don't want to go through all the hiring process if it turns out that 90% of what they do requires a security clearance and you are not qualified to get a security clearance.
Sure.
So in that instance, they will run the security clearance up front. So just be kind of aware of what that is. And look, the unfortunateness of it is that also know who you are. So if you are somebody who has a felony conviction behind your name and you're like, man, I really want to get into the public sector doing physical pen testing or cyber pen testing on the TSA or the FBI or whatever, chances are they're going to turn you down because of the felony conviction or any kind of criminality.
Sure.
So just, be aware of that. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. You just probably have to, go to the public sector.
Or private sector.
Or sorry, yes, the private sector, yes.
So then how common are public sector black teams?
I would say that black teams, both in the private and the public sector, are fairly rare, but they are becoming more common. And I think that the reason why they're becoming more common is two things. One, people are starting to realize the dangers of physical security and how far behind we are in physical security. The number of times that I have talked to a potential client and they say some derivative of, we don't understand why we should hire you because we know that you can get into our data center or our corporate offices or our board of directors room or something else. So why would we pay you to prove something that we know you can do? Well, think about what they're saying, right? They're saying that if you are competent in this field, you can get physical access to their most critical stuff. And they're aware of this. They're aware that this is the reality. So that's, again, I think people are starting to wake up and they're starting to realize this. Further, due to various regulations that especially the West and various NATO countries have passed, whether it's the new HIPAA laws or CER or DORA and IS2 or whatever, a lot of them kind of encourage, if not outright demand, far more physical testing than otherwise was present in the past. So HIPAA, for instance, passed a new regulation that basically said, and well, one of the stipulations basically said, all of that suggested physical auditing and pen testing that we were doing in the past, yeah, that's not going to fly anymore. Now you have to actually do it. And then when you think of, okay, well, what entities are HIPAA compliant? That's a lot. That's not just hospitals. That's everything, every entity and organization that has anything to do with medical records. That's a lot of institutions. And now to continue to say that you are HIPAA compliant once this goes through, you have to run audits and pen tests and other things like on a regular basis. And then the question becomes, who's going to do it? And I think now there's going to be this scramble of like, all right, well, not only who can do it, but who's doing it at professional levels, right? As opposed to just, well, I have a flipper and I can try to tailgate.
Sure.
Right? Because that's kind of where black teams get a bad name, is when you have somebody, even from reputable consultancy firms, who come in and they say, well, Bob, you pen test the web app, can you go break into the bank? And it's like, well, what he's going to probably try is he's going to try and clone a badge with a flipper if he gets the option. He's going to try and tailgate in. And it's like, okay, but whether or not he's successful, that is going to be the entirety of the report.
Sure.
And so then the client says, what did I just pay you for? Right?
Sure.
Like, you're not increasing my security. So these are the kinds of questions. And you're seeing this more and more.
Gotcha. And which sectors of government, as it stands today, tend to have dedicated teams? Which would contract, external expertise?
I would say every level of government. Every level of government. There isn't a, state level or federal level or whatever. I think that every level of government has, I have seen these types of teams at every level of government. Some countries do it better than others. Some countries have more of them than others. I think that they are still relatively rare, but they are becoming less so. It is one of those things that you are seeing more and more teams pop up all over the world. And I know this because I have these teams reach out to me on a regular basis for consultancy or training or questions or anything else, or even cross-training. And so it is a common thing. There isn't, but there isn't a one size fits all. Generally speaking, with government, the way that government tends to work across the board is that the higher up you go, the bigger budget you have. So if you're operating on, say, city council levels, your budget is very small. If you're operating at the state level, your budget is more. And if you're operating at the federal level, your budget is basically unlimited.
I feel like at the lower levels, though, it would probably be more contracting externally because it would be hard to justify at a city level expense at all.
It's interesting because at the city level, at just a pure city level, what you would likely have is police. You would likely just have the police who would do it. You can have private contractors, but you have to remember that when the public sector reaches out to the private sector, the cost is significantly more. So here's the cost benefit analysis of when you do this. If you have a public sector employee, now let me back up for a second. Public sector, you're usually going to get paid far less, but the work is going to be really interesting. And in the private sector, you're going to get paid way more, but you're going to have to go through a lot more of the grueling kind of mundane tasks. So in general, if you have, let's say, a team of, 5 teammates on the public sector side, and they're each getting paid, $60,000 a year, and you say, okay, we want you to run a black team engagement on a location, and you've got 2 weeks to do it, well, the only cost is their salary, which you are going to pay out anyway. But if you hire out a consultancy to a private company, the private company is going to say, well, you have to pay the consultancy's time, and then we have to make a profit for it, et cetera. So it's usually more expensive. So in that regard, I see consultancy more at the higher levels because they have a bigger budget.
Okay. It seems a little strange that historically this hasn't been as big of an industry as it is becoming in the public sector, because I feel like the public sector has many different assets that they should want to protect. VIPs,
Sure.
critical infrastructure, classified information, different things like that. So why hasn't black teaming been more common for these types of assets?
Well, for a couple of reasons. So a lot of people who listen to this podcast are going to be familiar with the Navy SEAL entity Red Cell. And Red Cell was effectively, I'm probably going to get the decade wrong. I want to say 70s, but I might be wrong. Red Cell was hoisted by their own petard, as it were, in which they were very good at breaking into military installations and showing the faults in security. The problem is that military installations are run by base commanders. And when you have a bunch of sergeants running around your base showing you that you are not doing a good job, you're embarrassing the cadre. And as a result, they will find an excuse to get rid of you. Now, there are other... I encourage any listener to go investigate that story because it's a fascinating story. Red Cell was certainly not squeaky clean on why they got canceled. But one of the big points on the public sector is that, one, people don't historically understand the risk because they don't. It's a weird dichotomy. On the one hand, you don't understand the risk of people walking into data centers or getting access to classified documents, etc. But on the other hand, you obsess over adversarial state entities like the Russians and the Chinese doing exactly that. So it's an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, where public sector security is like, well, nobody's going to actually sneak into our facility and get this thing. But on the other hand, you're spending all this time, money, and resources going, we have to make sure the Russians can't do it, right? So it's a weird dichotomy. But then the other issue with it is that a lot of people have a big misunderstanding of what physical security is. They think that if we have unclonable badges and we have really good surveillance cameras, well, there's no way you could get in. And it's like, but there's always a way to get in, whether it's social engineering, picking locks, building scaling, asset development, whatever. There's always a way to get in. And what your job as a black team is to test every single last possible way you can think of to get in based on what the building kind of has, and then write it all in a report. All right, here are 13 different ways we thought, looking at your building and looking at the life and breadth of this building, how we thought we could get inside. We tested every single one, and here's what worked and here's what didn't. And here's how you can fix it, right? So the thing is that a lot of entities, a lot of people just don't understand the value of that because a lot of the vulnerability comes down to human behavior. People wearing their badges outside. People holding the door open for tailgating. People leaving their windows cracked open for scaling. Like things like this, right? And then of course there's the mechanical aspect of things where you have a Eurocylinder lock that you can snap from the outside or drill from the outside or some derivative thereof. So it's just, I think as this becomes more common and more people are talking about it, people who the decision makers and the purse string holders, they start to understand, this is a problem. This is an issue. And as that becomes more and more of a thing and more regulations are saying you now have to do these things, it is becoming more common.
Sure. Can you maybe share an example or two of some high-risk targets that rarely get tested and talk about why that might be?
So in essence, and here's the sad reality, most locations, because security, physical security, often is derived from a compliance standpoint. So the way that this works is security has three pillars, right? Compliance, do you have the tools that you need to be secure? Defense, how are those tools used? And offense, the reality check for the defense. Well, by and large, 9 times out of 10, at any private or public sector entity, it is compliance and defense, and that's it. And it's very, very compliance heavy. In essence, the mistake that most entities make is, well, if we have the best cameras, the best locks, the best badges, etc., we are impenetrable. But then when you look at, the Palestinian Action Group at the RAF base, well, when you think of high security facility, what you probably think of is military, right? When we think of like tiers of physical security, it doesn't really get much higher than actual soldiers with LMGs and thermal cameras and all this kind of, hardware, right? So you literally have at a military installation a small standing army. So, and yet the Palestinian Action Group, when they got into the RAF base, how do they do it? Well, they hopped a fence with little electric scooters, a little pink pouch on one of them, scooted down the tarmac in the middle of the night, and then banged away on a couple jets and spray painted them, and then scooted off with no one being the wiser. Well, okay, so why? Well, the answer is simple. It was never tested, right? You had all the compliance stuff. You've got a bunch of 18-year-old idiots with, automatic weapons and thermal cameras and jets and all these kinds of things. So you've got the compliance standpoint. You've got the defense standpoint. You definitely have personnel on station securing things. But you never tested it. You never vetted it. And people end up getting complacent. And that right there is one of the biggest problems, complacency. Well, I don't really need to worry about this because we have cameras. I don't really need to worry about this because there's 30 people. I don't really need to worry about this because nobody's going to be that stupid. Sure. Right? But that's oftentimes what you get. So when you ask the question of like which entities aren't tested, the sad reality is most.
Gotcha. I'd like to talk a little bit about like the process for a pen test and how it might differ from private to public sector.
Okay.
I think maybe a good place to start is the statement of work. So can you talk a little bit about how that might differ from private to public?
Right. Okay. So one of the big, if not the biggest difference between private and public sector jobs, whether it's pen testing or anything else, is the statement of work is going to be very money focused in the private sector. And then in the public sector, it's basically results driven. So in the private sector, it's money driven, and in the public sector, it's results driven. So what I mean by that is in the private sector, if you come in and say, well, we want you to run a pen test, well, all of the nuts and bolts of this are going to be hammered out at the very beginning. How many people are you going to have on your team? How many people are going to be there? And what the time frame is and what we are expecting to accomplish, right? But if the client turns around halfway through the pen test and says, oh, could you also pen test this other building? And could you also throw in this social engineering aspect? And can you add these 5 flags that we didn't talk about? Well, the private sector is probably going to say, sure, for more money. But the public sector, because basically public sector entities are kind of on salary, they're just going to be like, okay. Like if the job goes from being 2 weeks to 2 months, well, then the job just goes from being 2 weeks to 2 months. Like, okay, it doesn't matter, right? So the big difference with the scope of work and how this is all kind of running is what is the driving force behind it? And in the public sector, it is very, like, I'm not saying that you're going to get bad results if you go to if you go to the private sector, you're not going to get bad results. It's just that the thing that is guiding the scope of work, how many teammates you have, the length of the engagement, all this kind of stuff.
Budget.
It's going to be the budget.
Yeah.
Right? But in the public sector, it's all about, well, we need this to be fixed in the correct way, ideally, right? And if that ends up halfway through, if your pen testers 2 weeks in go, my God, this is way bigger of an assignment than we thought. We need to drastically increase it. We need to bring more personnel in this. We need to pad this out by 2 months. Well, then chances are it's just going to happen, right? And budget be damned. Because realistically, the only thing that's costing is your salary. And so what does it matter if you're working on assignment A or assignment B? It doesn't. You're just doing the thing. So you tend to get a much more robust result when you do the public sector stuff because you can afford to do all the time. You can have, a team of 10, 20 people if you want, right? So that's kind of the big difference between the scope of work.
Gotcha. Would you say that rules of engagement also differ?
So rules of engagement, hilariously, tend to be more of a thing on the public sector than the private sector.
Interesting.
Because the public sector, depending on where in the world you're operating, because every employee in this hypothetical is a public sector employee, they will have rules. And sometimes those rules will be dumb. Well, you can't, for safety reasons, you can't go up a ladder if it's more than 10 feet tall without, this training, this certification or that, right?
Sure.
So if you've got a window that's 15 feet up and it's wide open in the middle of the night and you're a public sector employee, you can't go into it because you would have to take a picture of what you did. And if any auditor looked at that and said, wait a minute, that's 15 feet and you don't have, then suddenly you're in trouble.
Sure.
Right? So you can have a lot more stupid rules and regulations in the public sector because the public sector is guided by rules and regulations. But the private sector is kind of, I don't want to say the Wild West, but it's far more free in the rules and regulations kind of thing. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's a very weird, counterintuitive thing that most people don't think about.
Gotcha. Do you know of any, or maybe you have examples of mandatory hard stop scenarios that are unique to the public sector? You kind of talk a little bit about this ladder example, but maybe you have some others.
So basically in the public sector, you may get into hard stops kind of like that, where there's a regulation that stymies you in some way. So that can be an issue. But otherwise, your hard stops are kind of going to be the exact same, right? Suppose that you were running a pen test and your client has asked you in the public or the private sector to get into the board of directors VIP meeting room, and you do. And they say, what we want you to do is we want you to plant a listening device or a simulated listening device or whatever, and we want you to do that in this room as proof of concept. And suppose you get into that room, and suppose you start, locating the best place for a listening device, and you pull up the floorboards or you open up the ceiling panel or whatever, and hey, you find a weird device. You find something that shouldn't be there. Some Wi-Fi Raspberry Pi thing that's jammed up in the ceiling panel.
Huh.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that anything like that, and this goes for anybody who's done cyber pen testing, it's the same thing. If you're running a cyber pen test and you find an admin portal backdoor that some developer put in and forgot about, and it allows you admin level access to Facebook or something, the test stops. And you call the client contact and you're like, hey, we need to talk.
Gotcha. Now, let's talk a little bit about like authorization and vetting requirements. How do those differ for public versus private?
So we kind of talked about this prior, but in the private sector, you generally don't need any security clearances to get the job. But then as you progress, in order to do certain jobs, certain roles, certain engagements, you might need a security clearance. So if you go work at, and I'm not going to name names, if you go work at a consultancy firm, and you get hired as a mid-level pen tester, cyber pen tester, and you need no certifications, right? And you work there for 2 years, and then the sales guy comes up to you and says, hey, we've got this position, we've got this potential engagement, but it requires you to have this level of a security clearance. Would you be interested in doing that? So that's a common thing that happens. And then you slowly get various certifications. In the public sector, by contrast, oftentimes the majority of what they're doing will require a security clearance, and as a result, before you even get that job, you have to get cleared for the security clearance.
Gotcha.
So, and oftentimes, I don't know how it is anymore because things in the United States have kind of gotten shaken up with security clearances lately, but oftentimes what would happen is companies and entities would look for people who already have active security clearances to basically streamline that entire process.
Sure, that would make sense. So how does that, who's already had a background check, who already has a clearance, how does that change planning and team makeup?
Okay, so when it comes to, it kind of does, kind of doesn't. So in the public sector, you are getting hired for a specific role. You have to go through a security clearance ahead of time. And I would say the majority of people in the public sector kind of bounce around the public sector most of their career, if not all of their career. So in the public sector, you might get some really wild people. You might find yourself working with, oh, hey, here's Bob. Bob spent 10 years in the infantry doing, maybe the EOD. He went in the infantry and then he worked into the, bomb disposal and stuff like that. And then he moved into the public sector where he was doing deep cover operations with social engineering and things. And now he's on your black team, right? So, and you can have really interesting people in that regard. Oftentimes in the private sector, you don't tend to work with so many of those because the people who come out of the public sector who have like this long, rap sheet of like awesome assignments and engagements and things, they're usually the directors. They're usually the board, they're usually the C-suite. They're usually high ups, right? If you've got somebody who was 10 years in the military, 5 years in this public sector job doing black teaming and 5 years doing cyber red teaming and stuff like that, and then they come into the private sector, they're not going to be a consultant.
Sure.
They're going to be like the top person, right? And so oftentimes, now it does happen that you get people who came out of the military or the police or, whatever. But usually in the private sector, you're going to be working with younger people and they're usually going to have kind of your standard thing, right? I went to college, I got a few certifications, and I did X, Y, and Z.
Understood. So I feel like that kind of talks a little bit about the, before the test even begins. I'd like to talk now about recon. Does that differ across sectors?
No. Well, kind of. Okay, so one thing that you have to understand is that when you're dealing with public sector stuff, you get to play with all the fun toys, right? You basically have, not really, but you kind of have an unlimited budget, depending on where you're working. Now, unlimited budget is very asterisked, air quotes, but you have a big budget. Because your team have its own budget, but then you can borrow stuff often from other teams.
Sure.
So even if your team doesn't have a budget for something, but you're like, dude, I need that camera that you guys have that can read a license plate from 10 miles away. I got to borrow it, right?
Sure.
And so you can do stuff like that. And oftentimes, so the recon is the same, but the toys you might be playing with can differ. But at the end of the day, the methods, the techniques, all of it, it's all going to be the same. It's just going to come down to, if you're running a private sector entity, chances are you're not going to have authorization to go out and spend $100,000 on a kinetic, a sonic lock-picking device that will, decipher the pins acoustically so that you can go make a key, right? They're probably not going to give you authorization for a $100,000 toy to do stuff like that with.
Understood. So do you feel like there are any constraints in terms of operational hours, contractor schedules, or third-party vendors that shape scope in either sector?
So again, when you're dealing with the private sector, it's going to be very budget focused, right? So when you go, whether it's a third-party vendor or it's whatever, it's going to be very, very budget focused. And that means that at the end of the day, the client, the dichotomy here is that the client wants to pay as little as possible but get the best results. And the consultant wants to pad out the engagement as long as possible. Still give you good results, but of course there's that dichotomy, right?
And the longer the engagement, the more results you're likely
to
get.
Yes, correct. So it's one of those things that when you reach out to the private sector, you will be paying a premium. So just be aware of that. But also at the same time, also realize that when it comes to innovation, it usually comes from the private sector, right? When people in the public sector want to figure out what the latest, greatest thing is on pen testing, hacking, whatever, we go to places like DEF CON, Black Hat, et cetera, and we talk to the private people who are doing all this, right? All the research papers and other things. Now, that's not completely true, because if I asked most Americans, where do you think, which organization, public or private, has the best hacking tools? It's like, yeah, it's going to be the NSA, right? Of course it is. But the majority of things that you're going to be using are going to come out of the private sector that are going to be reallocated to the public sector. So it just kind of depends on, I don't think there's a big difference on that. It's just timing. How long do you have on the engagement?
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about physical security controls like biometrics, turnstiles, guards, all of those things. I would think that they would be more common in public versus private sector. How do they change entry plans?
So that is very true. Generally speaking, public entities, public locations tend to have better hardware security. That doesn't mean their security is better. It just means that they have better toys, right? They might have actual guards. They might have the best cameras. They might have cameras with AI. They might have biometrics. They might have unclonable badges, like all this kind of stuff. That doesn't mean the building is any more or less secure, because people make stupid mistakes, and oftentimes you can find ways into places. But it does mean that the public sector typically has more interesting hardware that you're going to have to bypass. That said, the private sector definitely has it, depending on if you go to like the headquarters of major corporations and things.
Gotcha. Are there any controls that frequently force you to change your approach midstream?
Not really. At the end of the day, when you're getting into buildings, when you're running pen tests, at the end of the day, your job is to find all the vulnerabilities, organize them into likely routes. If I put vulnerability 5, 10, and 20 together, I can get from the outside to the inside to, I don't know, the data center or the C-suite office or whatever. And you try to do that in as many possible ways that you can, because that's what the client wants, right? The client generally doesn't just want you to get into the building. They want to actually increase their security. Now, the one caveat to this is if the CISO or the facility manager or somebody, if they say, look, I know there's a big problem with our security, and I need to convince the board of directors that this is a big problem. I need you to break in. I'm going to pay you the meager budget I have to break into the building, scare the crap out of the board of directors, and they'll give me a bigger budget.
Sure.
Well, in that instance, if that's the motivation of the client, then don't do the stupid stuff. Stay as sneaky and stealthy as possible and help him to accomplish the motivation. Scare the board of directors into a bigger budget so that next year they can come and actually fix stuff. So, but by and large, you are going to try, hopefully, break into the building in as many ways as possible, locate all the stupid stuff they're doing, outline what worked, what didn't work, etc. So when you're doing that reconnaissance and you take into consideration the motivation of the client, the flags that they've asked you to accomplish, etc., it just depends on what things they have, what security they have in place. It's very few things are going to do a hard turnaround, right? Very few things are you're not. It's very unlikely that you're going to say, we have a plan to get into the building, and then you're going to come across something you're like, oh, well, that plan completely fell through because of this one thing. Right? That's unlikely, because by the time you formulated plans, you've already done the OSINT, the long-range recon, the short-range recon, the embedded recon. Like, you've already done all these kinds of things, and so you kind of have a very good idea of like the life and breadth of the building and how people come and go and what their security is and what their vulnerabilities are. And so by that time, you have a really good understanding of things. And often you don't do a hard reset on a plan. You might just pivot. You say, okay, well, instead of going this way, we'll still do the same plan, but instead of going this way, we'll go that way.
Sure. You touched on this a little bit earlier about the toolbox being a little bit different because public sector has access to more fun tools and different things like that.
Sure.
Are there any other ways that the toolbox changes from one sector to the other?
Not really. I mean, let me say it this way. There are private sector entities out there today who have dedicated social engineering teams whose sole job is to attempt to social engineer their own company, right? Like, literally, that's all they do full-time, 7 days a week. That's all they're doing is social engineering their own company, sometimes on the short term, sometimes on the long term. But that's a really interesting role. It's and that in a lot of ways is pen testing. It's literally just, can I social engineer you to do stuff you shouldn't do? And it just kind of comes down to, well, there's not a lot of that in the public sector. The public sector doesn't really have dedicated teams who are just solely pen testing, workers. Not a lot of them anyway. So, but the private sector does. So it just, when it comes to like what tools you have, well, I personally know several teams of social engineers who are very good at their job, and they just call their own company and try to social engineer them. Okay, well, that's a tool in your toolbox, right? If I said, hey, look, I need a really good social engineer who can call up a company and get them to say and admit things that they aren't supposed to do, I might go to that person, right? Because not only do they have the skills, but they have the experience of, like, for, 10 years, all you've done is called your own company and try to social engineer people. And you've probably gotten really, really, really good at it. But, if I needed somebody who spent 10 years doing deep cover where they go and embed themselves with criminal elements and pretend to be somebody else, I might talk to various people in the public sector, because there's a lot of jobs out there that do this. Very dangerous jobs, but there are people out there. So which of those is a better social engineer? I don't know. But they're both very good at their jobs.
I'm glad that we're talking a little bit about specialization, because the next place I'd like to take this conversation is about team composition. Mm-hmm. So how does team composition differ from public to private? So
oftentimes you will have much more experience in the public sector because your full-time job is black teaming. If you get on a black team in the public sector, that is what you're doing 9 to 5, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year, assuming you have no vacation. But that's all you're doing, right? So in a single year, you may run one pen test a month, followed by maybe a baby audit or something scattered in there every 2 months or something. And that's a realistic thing. That's a realistic, tempo. So you would probably get more experience running black team engagements in 1 year in the public sector than you might in like 5 or 7 in the private, depending on who you're working for. So if you're working for consultancy firms that specialize in cybersecurity, but they occasionally sell a physical pen test, then yeah, you're going to get little experience. That's why you need to help them. If you want to be doing this, you need to help them understand the value of it, and you need to help the sales team sell it. But there are other private companies who basically specialize in black teaming, and they would have just as much. They would have just as much experience. But when it comes to the who's going to be on your team, I don't really see a big difference, because generally speaking, on the public side, you're going to have a lot of public people. Maybe that's military, maybe that's police, maybe that's government, maybe whoever, public side people, right? And when you ask, like, okay, so my team consists of only governmental people. Well, what did you do? Maybe you came from the FBI, maybe you worked at the CIA for a little while and you got bored of it for whatever reason, or didn't like it, or didn't want to be away from home for so long. Maybe you used to work for the NSA and you got bored of sitting on your butt in front of a computer, and now you want to do, whatever. So you might have a very weird, diverse group of people, but they all have probably very interesting pedigrees. In the private sector, generally speaking, what you're going to have is a very heavy cyber pen testing group. Because
Sure.
that's where a lot of people get into this. A lot of people get into it by cyber pen testing, and then they start to transition into physical pen testing. And so you're going to have a lot of very, very savvy cyber pen testers. And these are going to be the people who, you get them in a building, and you get them physical access to hardware, and the client is screwed, right? Because they're inside, and these guys all know how to run pen tests and red team engagements and everything else. Okay, I give you physical access to a router or a printer or anything else. Yeah, they're done.
Sure.
But that's also a really interesting point, because on the private sector, most people who come into this, they're coming from a cyber end of things. Conversely, most people in the public sector are coming from a non-cyber, background.
Interesting.
So if I can get a private company into a building, give them physical access to printers and routers and workstations and things like this, they will have the cyber chops to immediately say, okay, we need to do this, right? But if I put a bunch of public sector guys, maybe they were former bomb disposal people or infantry or FBI or whatever else, and I put them in front of the computer, they may have no idea what to do. Okay, we broke into the building and we did these things, and I'm sitting in front of the computer. What now, right? So it's interesting. So it's but that's usually the difference that I see.
Gotcha. So I know that this question may be difficult to answer because the answer may be it depends too much. But can you give us an example of a public sector team structure?
I mean, the team structure will just be like any other team. You're going to have, ideally, a team leader, somebody who's making all the calls, ideally has the most experience in this. Hopefully somebody who can take over any role in case somebody goes down, gets sick, somebody's pregnant, whatever. Then you're going to have your specialists. These are going to be people who specialize in specific tasks. Maybe it's social engineering, maybe it's safe cracking, maybe it's building scaling, whatever. And then if you have the size for it, you might have burners and backups, right? Burners and backups. A burner teammate is ideally going to be your logistics guy or your cyber guy who doesn't really need to be in the building. And we throw him under the bus, metaphorically speaking, to get somebody else inside, right? Or throw somebody else off the trail, or to build rapport with somebody. So like maybe you need to build rapport with an asset so that you can develop that asset, and you use a teammate to burn themselves so that you develop the relationship between another teammate. So you can do all that. But the team structure doesn't really change. Now, there's one caveat to that. In the private sector, a lot of entities don't have big teams, right? So if you're in the private sector, there's a very good chance that you're running a 1 to 2 man team. And obviously, if you're running a 1 to 2 man team for a pen test, well, you don't have a structure like team lead, specialist, burner teammate, backups, etc. You're all of those things. And so you have to be very good at what you do, and you have to be very cautious. Because if I've got a team size of 10, well, I can afford to be stupid. I can afford to take risks. Because if one of my teammates gets burned, okay, well, I got 9 others, right?
Sure.
But if I'm a team size of 1, I have to be extremely careful. Extremely careful. Because at that point, the game's over, right? So you have to tailor it to who do you have on your team and what can you do. And another thing, like simple things, right? If you have a team of 10 people, well, think about what most buildings are. Let's go with a standard building. 4 sides, you've got the 4 sides of standard building. And when you're running, let's say, short to long range reconnaissance. Okay, how do you watch all 4 sides of the building at, office hours? You want to know how people, with a funnel, right? You want to know how people are coming in and out of the building. Okay, well, it's 9 a.m. and people are coming in. How do you watch all 4 sides of the building if it's just you? So little things like this, every aspect of it can change how you do it. But see, that's another question. If I say you have a team size of 10 in the public sector, and we want you to run a physical pen test, and you got 2 weeks, okay, not a problem. Mm-hmm. But if I say you got a team size of 1, and we want you to run a pen test in 2 weeks, well, you're asking that person to do way more work in that same time frame, and they can't afford to burn themselves. So like the whole dynamic of like the types of things they can do and the length of time it takes to do reconnaissance and everything, like all of this changes fundamentally if you have a small team.
Sure. So are there any roles that are mandatory for public work that aren't for private work? For example, compliance with all of these internal rules that you were talking about earlier.
No, not really. So a lot of the both public and private entities have a lot of compliance. Depending on where you are in the world, there's a lot of compliance. Depending on, and I'm not going to name countries because I don't want to throw people under the bus. Some countries have a lot of compliance laws and they just don't care. Some countries have a lot of compliance laws and they are adamant about all of them. So depending on where you are in the world, compliance laws may or may not mean anything to you. But that said, there are compliance laws and a lot of them in both private and public sector entities. To that end, I don't see much of a difference. It's just, there's a lot of compliance laws out there and you have to be very careful about them, right? So for example, if you're operating in, say, the United States, and I get into a building and the client says, hey, we want you to bug a client meeting room. And inside, and you happen to be in a one-party consent state. Okay, well, then you have to double check, but you likely can record a meeting, right, for the client, especially if that information is for the client and doesn't leave the building. But in places like Europe, well, you have GDPR. You cannot record people that can identify them. So that could be audio, that could be visual, that could be all kinds of things. So you have to be very careful about that. And you have to be careful about all the rules and laws and everything else. So anywhere you go in the United States, anywhere you go in the world, you have to be very, very careful about like what you can and can't do. And different countries will have very different laws. For example, Canada for a while was trying to ban the flipper, like the little Flipper Zero thing. They literally tried to pass a law that says you cannot have this thing. And it's okay.
Sure.
So if you had flown into Canada to do a physical pen test and you have that with you, that could be a problem.
Sure. I imagine one area that compliance is quite important in the public sector is with, communications, collecting proof, different things like that. You already touched on it in terms of recording. But how else does that, collection of proof, collection of communications, collection of just all of the security flaws, how does it differ from public to private?
So it really doesn't differ. Your job on a black team is to assess the physical security of the location in an actionable way, right? So you can't you have to record all the vulnerabilities, all the things they're doing right, all the things they're doing wrong, and then take those and combine them into routes, right? Okay, so we first identify all the vulnerabilities, and then we say, okay, well, I've seen vulnerabilities here, here, and here. Can we use that somehow to daisy chain it into getting access to, I don't know, the VIP meeting rooms or whatever, the third floor bathroom, whatever it is that the client has said, this is what you need to get into. But the interesting part isn't what you need to record, because you have to record everything, right? But there are, of course, GDPR laws. So if you're going to have body cams or you're going to have these types of things, you need to make sure it's legal to record that in the state or the location you are. You need to make sure that when you're going past, right? So suppose you go into your client says, well, we want you to get access to this location, but nothing can leave the premise, right? You can't steal anything and nothing can leave the premise. Okay, well, if nothing can leave the premise and I'm wearing a body cam and I go into your facility, I can't take that body cam with me, right? Because I would be taking the evidence off-site. So you may need to ask the client for a secure room in the building to store all the stuff so that it never leaves the premise. So you have to be very careful about okay, what can't you take off-site? For example, I've had clients before who say, well, we have burn bins throughout the building, and we want you to get access to the burn bins and then prove that you could steal the documents. Okay, but you can't take anything off-site. It's okay, well, then make sure that when you get into those burn bins and you pull out those documents that are so sensitive they have to literally be burned or shredded, and you stuff them in your pants or whatever you're doing, don't walk out of the building.
Sure.
Right? So you have to be careful. Now, the other thing that's also very interesting is when it comes to stuff like this, is if you plant a device, say that the client says, well, we want you to, bug a VIP meeting room or the printer or whatever, but you can't take anything off-site. It's okay, well, if I can't take anything off-site, then that device that I'm plugging in definitely can't be producing Wi-Fi. It can't be using a SIM card. It can't be externally moving that data anywhere. It can only be local, which means SD cards. And the interesting thing about SD cards is that right off the bat, if your client tells you nothing can leave premise, then that tells you right off the bat that your top priority needs to be persistence. Because if you're saying, well, nothing can leave the location, well, if you can only get into the meeting room once, well, how are you going to get back in to get your SD card? Right? How are you going to get back in to get this stuff afterwards, or figure out what you had? So you definitely need to get persistence. So a lot of these things will change your plan, your structure, your how you're going to go about things, and all of it.
So I know that one of your favorite, or not favorite, but I guess one common approach that you take is third-party staff, third-party contractors. Does this vulnerability change at all from one sector to the other, public-private?
So that aspect doesn't really change. What changes is all of the cleaning staff, cooks, or third parties in the public sector are probably vetted, to whereas in the private sector they probably are not. Now, vetted here can be a really, really broad term, right? Oftentimes, vetted may only mean we ran a criminal background check on you and you haven't committed any felonies, right? Well, that's a very, very loose term for saying that you should have authorization to have physical access to like Google's data center. So it depends on, or it doesn't depend. At the end of the day, these are always risks. These are always, always, always risks. And, third-party cleaners, third-party cooks, third-party whoever, they're going to have the lowest security training. They're going to have the lowest vetting. Because if I ask, let's take the CIA, for instance. Suppose let's do the Pentagon. The Pentagon is going to have very high security, right? But a 4-star general who's in charge of a department in the Pentagon is going to have a way higher security clearance, vetting process, etc., than the cook. But the cook or the cleaner may have almost as much access as the 4-star general, if not more.
Sure.
Right? So the issue here is third-party people, especially kind of low on the totem pole, like cleaners and cooks and things like this, they will have very high access. And this goes back to, this is across all industries, private, public, everybody. And while we do watch them, we try to watch them, it's insane to try and monitor. I looked it up once, and there was something stupid like 20 or 30,000 people who walk in and out of the Pentagon every single day, or at least have access to walk in and out every single day. And the funny thing is that if you said, well, maybe only 5% of the staff are doing stupid stuff, they're leaving doors open, windows open, letting people tailgate, etc., that's an astronomical number. When you talk about 5% of 35,000 per day are doing stupid stuff. And so it basically just becomes a numbers game. It becomes a numbers game of if you have a company of 10 people and you say 1% of people are doing stupid stuff, that's still a big deal. But if I say I have 10,000 people and 1% of people are doing stupid stuff, that's really bad.
Absolutely. Now, I know that the other third-party contractor approach relies on impersonating them. It's not, cloning their badge or something like that, but impersonating them.
Right.
Have you noticed any differences from one sector to the other in terms of success of impersonation?
Not really. Security in public sector entities tends to be higher just because of the nature of what it is. So it means that it can be more difficult. But at the end of the day, see, one of the things that people here's a misnomer. Here's a technique that people often confuse. When you say that you're going to impersonate a cleaner, when and how and to whom?
Sure.
See, the problem is that when you say I'm going to impersonate the cleaner, who are you not going to impersonate the cleaner to?
To the cleaner.
To the cleaner, right? Because that would be suicidal. That would be idiotic. For the same reason why, if you're going to impersonate the CEO of a company, you're not going to do it to the CEO or the board of directors or anybody else, right? So it's one of those things that you may, in your infiltration, breach the building, impersonate the cleaner upon, suppose that you see an open window and you hop the window, and you know through your reconnaissance where the cleaning janitorial closet is, and you go get the mop and the whatever, and inside your bag you've got a janitorial outfit, and you throw that on, and then you use that to move through the building, and you get up to a higher floor, then you go and store that stuff somewhere, and then you put on another outfit, maybe it's an employee work, attire or whatever, and now you're on the higher level floor impersonating the employees. So it doesn't mean that if you're impersonating the janitor, that's just what you're doing. It just may mean that, like, for this part of the engagement, or these floors, or this location, you're impersonating this guy, and then you're impersonating somebody else over here. And honestly, sadly, it does work a lot. But caveat here is that because the public sector gets to play with the best bells and whistles, there are now AI cameras that do a very good job at facial recognition. And so one of the things that you can do, especially in the public sector, and I assume the private sector will follow eventually, is you can have cameras that will pick out a person's face, and you'll have a database of all the people who work here. And it's like, okay, well, you don't work here. You should set off an alarm, right? So that should be an issue. So there are cameras today that are quite good at that. And I imagine that the private sector will follow suit, and they will slowly integrate these. Now, the big question there is GDPR and things like GDPR, because you're not allowed inside buildings, to record and store personal identifiable data. So that immediately runs in the face of, well, we need to have photos of every single people who work here from different angles so that the camera can, accurately pick out who you are. So it's an interesting question, but it's just like everything else with security, it's a cat and mouse game, right? The defense comes up with a toy, and then the offense tries to skirt it. It's just constant back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know from previous podcasts that humans are often the weak point that you utilize. I'd like to talk a little bit about how environmental or like company culture factors might make one sector different from the other. For example, openness of staff, or security awareness training, or visitor norms, different things like that.
Right. So here, ironically, I don't typically see much of a difference. The reason is that only when I'm talking public versus private. So public versus private, there isn't much difference in this, and it all comes down to front-heavy security. Security is not your employee's job. That is not why they were hired to do whatever it is that they do, whether it's a janitor or a tech guy or a C-suite or whatever. Their job is not to police the halls for intruders. And so there is this concept in physical security referred to as front-heavy security, which just means this. All the security is pushed at bottlenecks for the funnel, where the people are supposed to come in and out. And anyone who has gotten beyond those checkpoints is assumed to be authorized to be inside the building by everybody, because how else did you get this far in, right? And whether it's public or private, that's always true. I was doing a public engagement, a public building engagement a while back, and I was walking past the head of physical security, pretending to be on a call when I was actually recording. And I'm moving through the building, walk past a gentleman, and even though he didn't know who I was, even though this was a public building, because I was on a phone call, because I looked confident, and I had a badge that looked legit, he didn't say a thing to me. And it's like, well, again, it's this head of physical security. I'm on his floor. I'm walking through his wing, and he doesn't stop me because I look legit. I have a badge that looks legit. It wasn't. But it's just that, right? It's even the people whose job is security. A lot of people are very apprehensive because they think they're going to get in trouble. Well, this could be an employee. This could be a VIP. This could be whatever. And if you add on top of that the cherry of this person's on a work call, I don't want to interrupt this person and stop them and say, hey, dude, look, I'm sorry to interrupt your work call, but I don't know who you are. We need to go to security, or we need to vet you right now, right? That's a very uncommon thing to have, whether it's public or private. So ironically, some of the best security when it comes to the public or the employee mindset is private entity, small town. Because when you're operating in a tiny town, whether it's a big or small business, but a tiny town, in the private sector, everybody knows everybody.
Sure.
And as a result, it is next to impossible to impersonate anybody, because everybody knows everybody. And so everybody from the janitor to the cook to the employee to everybody knows everybody. And if a new face shows up, everybody spots them immediately. And they're like, you shouldn't be here.
Sure.
So weirdly, when it comes to people being security, that's actually some of the hardest.
Now, would you say that there are any procedural differences because of law enforcement or armed security being on site at public locations?
Yeah, okay, so generally speaking, the one rule tends to be that you can't lie to law enforcement, right? So if you are in the private sector, law enforcement, military, Secret Service, these types of groups, you can't lie to them. So you can lie to private security. You can lie to employees. You can lie to staff. You can't lie to law enforcement. So that would immediately change your tactics, because even something simple like here's a situation for you. You have you are a private consultancy firm who's been asked to run a black team engagement on a public sector building where actual law enforcement is at the front gate. Okay, well, that's interesting, because you can't lie about who you are.
Sure.
So you can't use the front gate if you're going to use a false alias. Now, you could create a fake company, or you could create, if this company allows for public meetings or something else, you could schedule a real meeting. You could do that. But you can't outright lie. You can't, tell law enforcement if they ask you, no, I'm actually Bob Smith or whatever. So going through the front gate in its entirety may be something that's not authorized if there's actual law enforcement there. Now, on the public sector side, if the public sector has said, okay, there's law enforcement, military, whoever on site, and we need you to get to this, whatever, inside the building, yeah, you can lie to them. You could do all kinds of stuff, right? Because you're the public sector, because you've been given authorization to do this. So this is a big difference, right? This is, again, the biggest summarization difference that I can give you is public sector means you get to play with the best toys, you get paid much less, but you get to have a lot of really interesting engagements. The private sector, you get paid way more. The engagements are going to be shorter, typically. And you definitely cannot lie to things like law enforcement and military. You just can't, with very, very rare exceptions. But that's usually how that goes. So you're going to have to plan. If you're a private entity trying to go against military or whatever, you have to be very careful. Also because you can't be stupid and get shot, right?
Sure.
So, one thing that you definitely don't want to do is if you're trying to pen test a building with armed security, you don't want to put your get out of jail card in your back pocket. And if someone puts a gun at you and says, caught you in the middle of the night sneaking in through a window or something, and they've got a gun drawn on you, you're like, no, I'm supposed to be here, and reach for your back pocket to show them, you got to be very careful about, all your procedures.
There is a letter in my back pocket.
Exactly.
Would you like to come get it?
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. You have to be very cautious about this. And you definitely don't want to send your junior pen testers on such engagements, because the actual risk of harm is elevated because of this.
Sure. So let's say that you achieve your objective. You're inside, and maybe you achieve your objective, or maybe you accidentally get identified. Either way, how does it differ? How does the response differ from private to public clients? For example, if you find a big flaw with the public sector, is it more likely to end up with a formal investigation or something like that?
Well, when you say big flaw, I assume you mean like there's a big security issue.
Yes.
So not really. You've been hired to do this job. Your job is to just find these vulnerabilities. That's literally why you're there.
But I'm talking about after you've done your job, you put together all of these, this report.
Right.
The public sector, I could imagine there may be inquiries, there may be formal investigations, there may be, it's also, some things may be subject to FOIA requests, etc.
So,
it's just different rules.
Yeah, so you can definitely have something like that. You can have, depending on what you found, right? But that's actually kind of true for public and private. So again, let's suppose for a minute that you are doing a public sector entity and you find a listening device in the board of directors room, okay? What is your incident response going to be if you find a listening device in a meeting room? Well, you're going to have the cyber guys come in and take a look at it. You're going to have the physical security guys take a look at camera logs and see if the device was planted, and you can see who did it, which chances are no. Then you're going to have the police come in and dust for prints, and you're going to see, okay, do we know who did it, right? And then we maybe will geofence it, and we'll look to see if we can, figure out cell phones and who's there, etc. But that's a shit show because you have phones coming in and out constantly. Well, what would you do in the private sector? Probably the exact same thing, right? So suppose the headquarters of Google or Meta or whoever, or OpenAI or whatever, they find a listening device in their R&D facility or their board of directors room. What would their response be? Probably exactly the same. The difference is, of course, well, that's not even true, because realistically, like I was about to say that national security issues aren't going to be in the private sector, but that's absolutely not true. You've got Raytheon, Google, like all of these people typically deal with national security in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, you can have national security instances if Google, Facebook, OpenAI, or whatever, if these entities were legitimately hacked into, like down to the bare bones, whether it's listening devices or their servers or whatever, I guarantee you there'd be national security issues. And so you'd handle that just like any other national security issue.
Gotcha. Do you have any examples, war stories that would maybe illustrate the differences in one,
Well, what I can tell you...
physical pen test?
Yeah, so one of the things that I can tell you that I was very impressed by, I was doing an engagement where it was kind of... how do I want to describe this? It was kind of a... So this is in the public sector, and it was kind of a constant back and forth. So we got asked to come in, do a physical pen test on a facility, make a recommendation, they immediately fix it, and then we come back in again and try to find another way in or another bypass or something else, and we just repeated this process over and over and over again. It was really fascinating. It was quite interesting to go into a building, scout it, recon it, do whatever you need to do, and then go into a building, and then have the head of physical security have a meeting with him at the end of the day and be like, okay, here's all the things that we did, right? And then they run off, fix everything, and then you come back and you try to re-break in with all the fixes going in. So this was kind of like, this exact thing happens on the private sector, but it's usually offset by like 6 to 12 months. In the private sector, one of the things that'll happen is you'll run a physical pen test, you'll offer recommendations on a list, like here's the most important, here's the least important. They will go and they will fix things, and then hopefully 6 to 12 months later, you'll come back and you'll actually see, okay, well, let's see if you're actually doing your due diligence and this all worked, right? But I've done public sector entity jobs where it's like the next day.
Sure.
Like they actually have people come in and fix everything, and then you come back the following day and like, they changed that, they changed this, they fixed that. And so it's very fascinating to come back and just watch a building security in real time get more and more robust and still be asked, like, keep trying, keep banging away at it. I think that's probably one of the better examples I can give you of, in the private sector, you will have remediation done, but it will be delayed. And then you might be brought back in, 6 months later to test it. But I've had public sector jobs where it's like the next day, they're like, all right, try again.
Sure. Well, is there anything else, any other differences between one and the other that we should discuss that we haven't talked about already?
So I don't think that there's much difference that we haven't discussed. Let me be very clear here. Whether you're doing black teaming on the private sector or the public sector, there's no wrong answer here. They are both very enjoyable professions, very rewarding professions, and they're things that genuinely need to happen, right? If you understand why cyber pen testing is important, then you should understand why physical pen testing is important for the exact same reasons, right? It doesn't matter how much cyber security you have in place. If I get physical access to the mainframe or the server or whatever, you're done, right? So it's one of those things that I believe there was a story in Korea recently, I think it was Korea recently, where there was a fire in a data center and they lost hundreds of terabytes of government records that they didn't have any other backups for.
Whoa.
Right? So it's not just... well, you could, maybe you can inject ransomware or something. It's also, there's all kinds of stupid stuff that you could do with physical access to things that could catastrophically harm information, power, critical infrastructure, all kinds of things. And, as a listener to the podcast, I want you, all the people listening to this, I want you to think about just, after this, just take a minute and think. If your client came to you today and said, there's going to be a really, really important meeting that's going to happen in this, whether it's government or private, doesn't matter, but this really, really secure VIP location. There's going to be a meeting held in there. How could you, through the internet, through cyber means alone, listen in to that meeting? And what would you have to do to go about it? That could be very hard. It may be impossible, especially if I say the meeting is next month. You've got 30 days to figure this out, right? That could be near impossible. But if I say you have 30 days to find any way to get into that meeting room and plant a listening device or whatever, or bribe somebody to plant a listening device, or that's the difference, right? If I say, what does it take to get physical access to a thing, is probably way easier than the chain of zero-day exploits that may be required to bug a listening room through the internet.
Sure.
So I really hope that people understand that whether you're doing this through the public or the private sector, there's no wrong answer here. It's a really important thing that is actually taken on by well-trained and seasoned people. And if you're new to this, get into it. There's definitely a demand for this type of profession, and I encourage any listener or anyone who's interested in this to give it a shot, because there's definitely a huge demand for this type of work.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us for today's deep dive into public versus private sector black teaming. We hope it gives you a clearer view of how mission goals, risk appetite, and red tape shape the way physical security gets tested.